Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second show today. If you didn't catch the first one with Dr. Glyn Harper about the New Zealand division, it was definitely worth going back and watching on catch up. Anyway, we are continuing our Torch to Tunis series with a look at the role of the leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and various others in the planning of Operation Torch. Paul M. Sparrow is a former director of the FDR Library and Museum and a TV documentary producer, writer, and speaker. And before I bring him in, again, we're views are going up, subscribers are going up. So if you're new to the channel, welcome aboard. Please consider becoming a channel member or a patron. And as always, all the information you need is in the description below. Links to social media accounts, etc., etc. But without further ado, I'll bring Paul in. Good afternoon, Paul. How are you today?
I'm great, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm very well. So you obviously, as a director of the FDR Museum, you're a former director. Your focus probably began with FDR's role in this and then kind of expanded outwards. But in general, before we bring up your presentation, do you think that sort of 42, 43 period in Operation Torch is generally overlooked in his career?
Well, I think the concept of how they were preparing for the war that was coming, you have to remember how hopelessly unprepared the United States was up until Pearl Harbor. And then it really took them a year to be fully implemented as building the army, getting the weapon systems in place. So it was a year of great struggle, and they didn't even have really an effective military leadership structure in place either. And of course, I am very focused on the nature of this relationship between Churchill and FDR. It's fascinating, one of the most extraordinary relationships in 20th century history, maybe in American history. And so understanding their relationship and how it evolved helps understand how Torch came to be, because it's, as we all know, somewhat unusual for a president to overrule his military leaders.
No, definitely. And, we all kind of know that at face value that these two leaders got on very well. But as we will find out during the presentation, the late 42, early 43 period puts some strain, it's fair to say, on the relationship between the two countries, something that eventually had to be addressed. And that's been the kind of the recurring theme, is that by 44, a lot of, not all of the wounds are healed, but there is a lot more cooperation. I think the aims have been agreed, and I think the direction has been sorted out. But it is worth acknowledging the fact that middle part of the war, aspirations, ideas, ambitions were not quite in alignment between the two countries. But anyway, you've come with a PowerPoint, which you'll guide us through, folks. We'll do some of the questions as we go along, but I think that a lot of the subjects will be covered as we go along. But of course, we welcome your contributions. But basically, I'm going to hand over to my guest to take us through this really fascinating period of history. So over to you, Paul.
Well, thank you very much. And that understanding the importance of this relationship, it really is extraordinary. If you think about these two men and their relationship helped save the world from fascism, and they created the post-war global order that we are still living in today. So I'm going to back up a little bit before we go totally into Torch, because you have to understand, and I'll try to go through this quickly. Most of you probably already know a lot of this, but the Nazi invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939, which launched World War II, was Hitler's attempt to provoke England and France into declaring war. And his blitzkrieg, this new military technique, sort of shocked everyone. And Winston Churchill, who had been in exile essentially for many years, is brought back into the war ministry that Chamberlain founds as the First Lord of the Admiralty, which was a position that he had held during World War I, which was similar to the position Franklin Roosevelt held during World War I, which that he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And so Churchill is playing this role, which is different than what he had played in the First World War, but brought him back into the realm of power. On September 11th, just 10 days after the German invasion of Poland, FDR writes a letter to Churchill in his role as the new head of the Royal Navy. And thus begins one of the truly most extraordinary exchanges of correspondence in the 20th century. Over the next 5 years, they send more than 2,000 messages to each other. They spend 113 days together at meetings and conferences, and formed a friendship and an alliance that is unprecedented. In his letter, he says, "My dear Churchill, it is because you and I occupied similar positions in the World War that I want you to know how glad I am that you are back again in the Admiralty. What I want you and the Prime Minister to know is that I shall at all times welcome it if you'll keep me in touch personally with anything you want me to know about, you can always send sealed letters through your pouch or my pouch. This is such an extraordinary letter, violating, centuries of military and diplomatic protocol. The sitting president sending a newly selected war minister of a foreign power involved in a war in which we are officially neutral. It's just extraordinary.
I always think, just to interrupt, Paula, I think if they were corresponding today, their messages would be on WhatsApp and they'd be full of GIFs and memes and emojis, because it was informal, despite the fact they were talking about very serious things. They had this sort of it's beyond a friendship, but it's sort of a joshing, a polite joshing back and forth, and names and nicknames. It was a very modern relationship, I think.
Well, it was complicated, particularly because before Churchill becomes prime minister, there are protocols here to be followed. Yeah. And of course, Churchill is in the role of supplicant, right? He is basically begging Roosevelt for help, and Roosevelt is constrained by the Neutrality Act. So we'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, so Churchill's initial communications, he has to run this letter by the War Ministry and the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, but he signs his return correspondence as from naval person. Doesn't use his name at all. And after he becomes prime minister, FDR refers to him as former naval person. So throughout all the correspondence, it's, personal, top secret, from naval person to president, or from former naval person to president. And it sort of goes to this unusual quality that their alliance and friendship had. So one of the reasons FDR wrote Churchill was that he hated Chamberlain. He thought Chamberlain was a disaster, and he felt that he and Churchill saw the world in the same way. They disliked, trusted Hitler. Appeasement was a disaster, and the only way to deal with this was going to be through military action. Okay, jumping ahead a bit further. November 1940, FDR is reelected to an unprecedented third term in office, and despite intense opposition from Congress and an isolationist public, FDR launches this major effort to rebuild America's military, particularly its Navy. Now, this comes in light of Churchill's, at this point, desperate pleading for help and support and destroyers and all these other things. And so America starts the big ramp up for what they have to do. But again, like I said, the Neutrality Act is really preventing FDR from acting. A lot of people don't realize what the official Neutrality Act said was that America could not sell weapons to belligerents involved in the country, could not allow weapons to be transported on American vessels. American vessels couldn't enter their ports. American citizens couldn't go on their vessels. It was very, very restrictive. And FDR spent the next 2 years just trying to constantly change that nature of that relationship. So in December 1940, he starts, he goes on this cruise and thinks about how is he going to help Churchill. And he comes back and he has this press conference where he says, oh, I don't have much to talk about today, but there's one thing I want to say, and that's, American weapons are more effective in the hands of the British than in our warehouses. And, if your neighbor's house was on fire and he asked to borrow a garden hose, you'd lend him the garden hose because, he needs to put his house out. And when he's done, he'll give you the hose back. If it's ruined, he'll buy you a new one. But it's a win-win situation. And this is sort of him laying the groundwork. And then he, in a fireside chat, he talks about this idea of lend-lease and about America becoming the great arsenal of democracy. And this is really a turning point. Now, he's been elected to a third term. He's no longer fearful of the isolationists and being defeated. He's going to go forward with what he believes America has to do to support England in any way it can. And of course, this gearing up of the great arsenal of democracy is sort of a thread that goes through the rest of their relationship, particularly in June of 41, when Germany invades the Soviet Union. Now, all of a sudden, there's two countries that are needing weapons from the United States. And that relationship becomes stressed. So during this time, the cargo going across the Atlantic to keep England in the war and alive is being increasingly devastated by the U-boats. And so, again, FDR keeps pushing the territorial waters of the United States further and further out into the Atlantic. They keep ramping up the amount of ships. And in this expanded area, there's essentially a war, a secret war going on where at some point, Roosevelt calls the U-boats rattlesnakes of the Atlantic and says if they and any American vessel that encounters a submarine, it can shoot first. Hitler still doesn't declare war on America because he doesn't want America getting in the war until he has taken care of England. So in the summer of 1944, FDR first starts considering the idea about, how do we respond when we do get into this war? And should we invade North Africa? Should we go through France? And obviously, Churchill wanted America to get into the war right away, but FDR wasn't quite ready to do that because the American public was still very, very strongly isolationist. But they wanted something, a face-to-face meeting, because the two men had not met except for a very brief moment back in World War I, face-to-face, and they certainly hadn't met as the leaders of their two countries. So they start going back and forth, and they arrange for this secret meeting in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, Canada. And this is really, a lot of people don't appreciate how critically important everything else that happens was to this meeting. You can see here the two ships. President Roosevelt arrived on the USS Augusta after secretly ditching the media back on Cape Cod. Winston Churchill arrives on the HMS Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales comes out of the fog on a morning, and it's sort of this amazing moment. And then Churchill comes aboard the boat, and FDR is standing there. That's his son, Elliot, standing next to him. He's holding on to him. He's in his steel braces. And there's this moment where the two of them see each other for the first time. Churchill actually has to present his credentials to the president. And FDR later wrote to his cousin Daisy Suckley that the two men lunched alone, which cut the ice both ways. He's a tremendously vital person. I like him. But think about how different the outcome of World War II might have been if they had decided they hated each other. How leaders often, the egos and the power and the little slights, if they had decided they didn't like each other, it would have been a very different world. But turns out they hit each other off. Although even in this first meeting, their disagreements immediately came to the fore. Churchill wanted weapons. He wanted a declaration of war. And all FDR offered him were words. The Atlantic Charter, the idea that here's what we're fighting for. Here's what the post-war world should be. Here's what freedom is for everyone around the world. And so it was not what Churchill wanted, but it was what FDR wanted, because he knew he couldn't sign a deal without having to take it back to Congress. But in this meeting, FDR insisted that there be no official, discussions or military strategy sessions or anything. But it was obviously right away that the American military leaders and the British military leaders really didn't get along. There was a lot of suspicion, a lot of distrust. The British looked down on the Americans as sort of incompetent amateurs, and the Americans looked at the British as a bunch of arrogant has-beens. So it was not a great moment, although Churchill and Roosevelt really hit it off very well.
Just a quick question for you, Paul, because I just want to take you back a little bit to the period before Churchill was PM, because there were a couple of comments in the sidebar about their initial letters it being exchanged. Was it sort of a deliberate conspiracy to sort of circumvent the ambassadors and the official channels, and or was it more starting as two people who genuinely had respect for each other that did end up becoming sort of circumventing official channels? But what's your comment on that?
Absolutely, they're trying to avoid official channels, right. And it was a dangerous game, and so much more dangerous for Churchill than for FDR. But if it had gotten out, I mean, FDR was even accused of having a secret plan and planning secretly with the Churchill to get into the war before Pearl Harbor. But yes, I think FDR didn't want to go through the State Department, didn't particularly trust the State Department, detested Chamberlain and the prime minister, who was surrounded by these appeasers, and he was looking for someone there that he could work with, that he could count on. And of course, Churchill knew, both as First Lord of the Admiralty and then when he became prime minister, that England had no chance of winning this war without the resources of the United States.
And Joe Kennedy came up in the sidebar as well. What did both leaders feel about Joe Kennedy in the kind of 1940 period? Because he's there and well-known Anglophobe, basically.
So Kennedy plays a very interesting role in this whole thing, as does Charles Lindbergh on a different track, because Kennedy really is sending messages back to FDR saying the British are going to lose. We should be negotiating with Hitler. We should be negotiating with Germany. We should be preparing for Germany to win this because the British can't do it. And Kennedy and FDR had a real falling out over this prior to the 1940 election. As a matter of fact, at one point, FDR was concerned that Kennedy was going to run against him because it was an unprecedented third term and there was so much controversy around that. And of course, he didn't do it till after the election, but Kennedy resigns as the ambassador to the court of St. James right after the election, and remains critical of Roosevelt's policies, and more importantly, critical of Churchill and England, and for quite a while continued to express his support for Nazi Germany.
Thanks.
So Churchill is really in a situation, particularly after he becomes the prime minister in May of 1940, because he's understanding that without this American support, all he can do is maybe come to a stalemate. The fact that up until June of 1941, when Operation Barbarossa, he feels like the knife is at his throat because there's, hundreds of thousands of German troops and landing barges and aircraft, and the whole German military is poised to strike at England. And if it hadn't been for those RAF pilots and the invention of radar, never have so many owed so much to so few, right? Then Germany couldn't get air superiority, and without that air superiority, they couldn't launch the invasion. So during that whole period, Churchill's desperate for destroyers, and they make the destroyers for bases deal. And in the very beginning, right after Dunkirk, Churchill was desperate for weapons. They have nothing. Everything was left on the beach. And in a meeting between General Marshall and Franklin Roosevelt says, "I want you to send all the weapons we have over to England." And Marshall says, "Of course, we can't do that, Mr. President. I absolutely will not do that. And there's no way to do that." And FDR says, "Well, all you have to do is declare them surplus and no longer needed." And Marshall's like, "I can't do that. If I were to do that, I'd have to go to church every day for a week." Roosevelt says, "Well, you have to go to church every day for a month. I don't care. You're going to do it. Send the weapons." And so tens of thousands of machine guns and rifles and all sorts of equipment were sent to England after Dunkirk illegally, by most people's opinion, gross violation of the Neutrality Act. But it was one of the many ways that Roosevelt was trying to get around the rules to help Churchill.
But also, if you don't mind me saying, also to help the USA, Larry Ferrero made the point in his book, American Arsenal, that the Lend-Lease is often seen as a one-way street. It's just US funneling stuff to Britain and later to the Soviet Union. But in fact, the money that was going back and the ideas are going back, the destroyers for bases things, is that FDR, correct me if I'm wrong, also realizes that Lend-Lease is opening up a two-way street where resources will come to the US. And, what's your feeling about the fact that there's a perception now that Lend-Lease is kind of the big US helping little England? It's both ways, isn't it?
Well, England was broke. And the Neutrality Act up at that point was basically FDR had gotten the Congress to change it so that it was a cash and carry deal where the British could buy whatever weapons they could afford and carry them on their own ships. And so what happened was that after the Arsenal of Democracy speech, he basically says, "No, we're going to give them these weapons for free. And at the end of the war, we'll work it out," basically. Because, again, he knew that what the United States was gaining here was that they were gaining time. They were gaining time. Remember, when Germany invaded Poland, the entire American armed forces were only about 250,000 men. There were more than 250,000 Germans held in reserve when they invaded France and Belgium, right? So the American army was essentially non-existent. The number of planes and tanks and weapons and things like that were available to them was nothing. And so part of the great advantage of Lend-Lease was that it allowed Americans to build up their ability to manufacture these weapons of war. And that's what, more importantly, it held off the Germans, and basically, the British took the brunt of the initial war until they turned on Russia. And that allowed America to get back on its feet because it was just woefully unprepared. So on December 7th, FDR is sitting in his study with Harry Hopkins, his close aide and friend. He's looking at his stamps, 147. He gets the call from Knox. Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor. We all know that story. But what's important about that story is that up until that moment, I'm not a big believer in any of the conspiracy theories, but the British and the Americans had been tracking a huge Japanese naval force moving south through the Sea of China, and they were assuming that they were going to attack either Malaya or the Philippines or Singapore, one of those areas. And Churchill was terrified that if the Japanese attacked British or Dutch colonies, that the Americans wouldn't get in the war, that it wouldn't be enough to push the American public into supporting a war. And so then when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, this was for Churchill, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a blessing. It was the worst day in his presidency for FDR, the worst day of his life, the worst military defeat in American history. But in that defeat, Roosevelt sort of rose up and evolved into this great commander-in-chief. The moment Winston Churchill heard the news, he called the White House, "Mr. President, what's this about Japan?" he says, and the president says, "Yes, it's quite true. They've attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now." And Churchill, of course, well, this certainly simplifies things. God be with you. And so, he was secretly pleased. In his memoir, he has this wonderful line where he says, "But now at this very moment, I knew the United States was in the war up to the neck and into the death. So we had won after all. I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful." So that's how important this moment, this December 7th moment is. It really is the pivot on which everything else happens after that. Because, when FDR said we're all on the same ship now, Churchill took him quite literally and immediately got on board the HMS Duke of York and went across the Atlantic in horrific, winter conditions to meet with Roosevelt face to face in Washington. So in the press conference in the Oval Office when Churchill arrives, obviously the press are stunned. Nobody had any idea he was coming, he says, Churchill says, "I can't describe the feelings of relief with which I find Russia victorious, the United States and Great Britain standing side by side. It's incredible to anyone who's lived through the lonely months of 1940. Thank God." And then one of the reporters asked him, "So how long do you think it'll take to lick these boys?" And Churchill, in his inimitable style, says, "If we manage it well, it will only take half as long as if we manage it badly." So, there's already you're starting to see, and when the press conference starts, about 200 reporters jammed into the room for this press conference. And the people in the back couldn't see him. So they said, "We can't see you. We can't see you." So Churchill stands up and they continue to say, "We can't see you, Mr. Prime Minister." So you can see the chair he's sitting in there. He stands up on that chair and he's waving to the reporters in the back of the room. And it just sort of goes to show, his understanding of the importance of the press, but also the very informal nature of their interactions. So now you've got this moment, Christmas Eve. And remember, there's been blackout in England for 2 years. Here they are, Churchill and Roosevelt standing on the South Portico, watching the lighting of the Christmas tree. They both do, worldwide broadcasts of their comments this night. And it's a very, very powerful and emotional moment. And I think, it goes to the fact that these were not just two politicians, but that these were two men with deeply held beliefs who had come together at this critical moment in history, and they knew that. So one of the big things they wanted to do was create what they were initially calling the Associated Nations, an international coalition of people fighting the fascists. On January 1st, the day that the announcement was supposed to be signed, there was last-minute scrambling with the Russian ambassador and Ambassador Sung from China, and Hopkins and Marshall and Churchill. Everybody's running around trying to finalize this thing. And Roosevelt had never really liked the name Associated Nations. And so in the afternoon, right before the ceremony, he gets this idea, and Churchill's room is just down the hall. So he wheels himself down into Churchill's room, bursts into the room. There's Churchill getting out of his afternoon bath, half naked. And of course, it's like a very embarrassing moment. Roosevelt comes in going, I've come up with it, Winston. We're going to call it the United Nations. And then he sees him. And Churchill says, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." And thus the phrases United Nations and special relationship were born at the same moment. So the big thing that happened at the Arcadia conference is that they created what they called the combined chiefs. So this was something that some of the British military leaders really opposed, with the idea that they had to have a combined leadership and that these combined chiefs would be based in Washington and that they would coordinate all military activity, how to allocate resources, high-scale strategic strategy. And so this is actually a photograph from 1943 because I couldn't find any photographs of the meeting in 1942. So on the U.S. side, you've got General Marshall, General Hap Arnold, Admiral Stark, King. And on the British side, you've got Sir Dudley Pound, Field Marshal John Dill, Sir Charles Porter. Those of you who are familiar with the battles to come know that these were the sort of the main players. Alan Brooke was still in England. He was about to take over for John Dill. But the most important thing was that they decided that Europe first in the strategy, right? Hitler's more important than Japan. We will agree that we will provide a majority of our resources in Europe, and that we will sort of hold our own in the Pacific. America would be in charge of Pacific. British would be in charge of India, and the Mediterranean and Europe would be a joint operation. So during this time, the British are having a hard time in North Africa. During the conference, Rommel, destroys about 100 British tanks, and he wins a major battle, retakes Benghazi at the end of January. So, for the British, they're very focused on North Africa. And then in June, Churchill comes back to Washington. They meet again for the Argonaut Conference. And at this point, the discussion about North Africa had happened in January at the first meeting, but, the Americans really weren't very well organized or prepared. There was a lot of pushback. A lot of it was sort of logistical stuff. How are we going to get weapons? How do we make this Lend-Lease thing work? Those sorts of issues. But by June, the British had a very specific plan. They want to invade Morocco and Algeria. And of course, the Americans are thinking, no, let's go and let's land in France and kick the Germans' butt.
Well, then this is just to interrupt you, Paul. This is where the Europe first, which sounds easy, exactly what is meant by it, because clearly geographically North Africa isn't Europe, and this is the context of that we've been just talking about these couple of weeks. Is the Mediterranean campaign generally is it part of the ETO or not?
Right.
It's certainly part of the Germans that were lost there were Germans that were coming from Europe, but this is a debate, and where clearly, as you're going to go into this, the tensions kind of build as to exactly what was meant by that. It's a very easy statement to make, isn't it? We're going to go Europe first, and then afterwards, I bet people are leaving that meeting going, "What did we actually mean by that?"
But because, of course, even not including the Pacific, there are 4 different theaters going on here. There's the war that's raging on the landmass of Europe. There's the war raging in the North Atlantic. There's the war raging in the Mediterranean, and there's the war raging in North Africa. And they are really interconnected, but 4 very different theaters in which America has very, very different levels of involvement. And so, but, Roosevelt, sides with Churchill and the British, saying, no, we need to get on the offensive, just like they had done at Midway. We need to take the initiative. We can't just be sitting back here doing rope-a-dope and getting beat up. We have to take the initiative. And Roosevelt was often unappreciated for his encyclopedic knowledge of world geography. He knew every port, every town, every city in the world, partly because of his stamp collection. He had been studying, international countries, and because of his deep interest in naval history, he really understood global naval strategy. And so he understood the advantage of attacking North Africa. More importantly, he understood how vital it was that the Allies get control of the Mediterranean, because, the British fleet is getting hammered in the Mediterranean because of the German bombers and the fighters, even the Italians. And so without getting control of the Mediterranean, you really can't do anything in Europe. The American generals didn't see things that way. As a matter of fact, the conflict between Marshall and Roosevelt regarding this got to the point where Marshall was on the verge of quitting, and it is a theme that runs throughout this whole thing until Torch is over. So Marshall brings in Ike Eisenhower to be the chief of the War Plans Division. He'd soon promote him to commander of the European Theater of Operations. He eventually takes over the Allied forces in North Africa, and then the European and Mediterranean Theater of Operations, where they keep changing the shape of the field. But it's clear that Eisenhower is being given increasingly significant leadership roles. And of course, this really grates with the British, who've been fighting this war now for almost 3 years. And they're like, this guy's like, he's a logistics guy. He's got almost no battlefield experience whatsoever. You're putting him in charge. And you can imagine how people like Dill and Dudley and, Montgomery would respond to this, all who had spent time, in trenches and in the battle. And so it increased the tension between the two sides. However, Eisenhower did prove himself very effective at being a diplomatic leader and in working within this, at this point, shotgun marriage between the Americans and the British. On the British side, you have Brooke there, Alan Brooke on the right, and John Dill on the left there. So Dill had been the chief of the military affairs. He steps down in December, right when Churchill goes to Washington. Brooke takes over, but Brooke actually stays in London during the first of the conferences. These two guys are absolutely appalled at the idea of a combined chiefs of staff. That the Americans are going to get to tell us what to do? Are you crazy? We can't allow these idiots, these bumbling amateurs. And so the friction is sort of built into this relationship. And Dill at this point had, been in the beaches. He was there trying to get the British soldiers off the beach in Dunkirk and Brest. So he really had skin in the game, as they say. And Brooke emerges as this very important advisor to Churchill, and one of the few people that would stand up to Churchill and say, no, that's a terrible idea. You're an idiot. You can't possibly do that stuff, And he was constantly pushing back against Churchill, who would come up with 10 ideas a day, 9 of which were disastrous, one of which was brilliant. So without Brooke, who knows what would have happened, really. So I'm sure this is old news to most of you, but the idea of the Operation Torch, where there be these 3 landings on the Atlantic coast of Morocco and on the Mediterranean coast of Algeria. The Americans would take the lead, particularly in the landings in Morocco, to hide the British involvement a little bit, because the French. So remember, this whole area is controlled by the French, who are now officially Vichy France, right? They are controlled by the Vichy government, and the Vichy government is an ally of Nazi Germany, essentially under the control of Hitler. So no one knew exactly what's going to happen. There's about 120 to 150,000 French North African troops, naval vessels, aircraft, tanks. And so it's not clear what's going to happen. When the Americans come ashore in Morocco, particularly in Casablanca, they initially meet intense resistance. George Patton, by the way, is the commanding officer of the American landing force here. And it's touch and go. The British in Oran and in Algeria, some places they meet heavy resistance, some places they don't. The Allies' hope, of course, is that the French will quickly say, "We hate the Germans. We're joining you guys." But it does take a while, and it exposes. This was the first major joint operation with the British and Americans trying to work together, and to get the number of ships they needed and the landing craft and the airplanes and coordinate everything. I mean, the poor infantrymen were stuck in the holds of these cargo ships all the way across the North Atlantic. Again, in November, it was brutal conditions, but they do successfully have the first amphibious landing. They learn a lot, and eventually the French do decide, to cooperate. So right after Torch, Churchill and Roosevelt start talking about we need to have another secret face-to-face conference. Let's do it in Casablanca. And here starts one of my favorite exchanges of correspondence between the two of them. So Churchill sends this message saying, we have to come up with a cover story because we're going to disappear for so long. And I'll be traveling under the code name Commodore Franklin. And you need to come up with a code name for you and for Harry Hopkins. So Roosevelt immediately responds the same day, sends Alex back the same day, saying that he will be going under the name of Don Quixote and Harry Hopkins will be Sancho Panza. And this is so unusual to see this kind of joke happening. Again, remember, these are top secret communications in the middle of a horrible war. They're planning a secret conference. And if you notice, I don't know if you can read it or not, but item 4 here is FDR suggesting de Gaulle postpone his visit and that he did not want to give the French general any time. That's about as concise a definition of his relationship with de Gaulle as I've ever seen. So then Churchill responds, right back again, however, did you think of such an impenetrable disguise in order to make it even harder for the enemy and to discourage irreverent guesswork? Propose Admiral Q and Mr. P. We must mind our P's and Q's. So I do think, as you said earlier, there was this humor, there was this ability to break out of the formality of diplomatic language and military structure, to reveal how they felt about each other. And again, for a message like this to get through, Churchill has to dictate it to the secretary. The secretary has to bring it to the encoding room. It has to be encoded. It has to be transmitted across the Atlantic. It has to be received. It has to be decoded. It has to be brought to FDR in the map room. I mean, it's a complicated process, and yet they're making jokes about their code names.
And yet you can imagine at the time, though, Paul, it is, we talk about it a lot. That period is the middle part of the war. The outcome is not yet clear. Maybe we're over the worst, but we don't really know at the time there. So given all the depressing memos that we must be circulating all the time about lack of this, we need more for this, it probably was to both of these individuals' benefit that the messages came in, did make them smile as well as inform them about the situation, because it meant that during your day, there's something passing across your desk that you're kind of looking forward to.
And this is very much in keeping with FDR's personality. Everyone who worked with him particularly closely said he would always try to lighten the moment. He would always make jokes and do practical jokes on people and have it, his cocktail hour, his children's hour every day at 5 o'clock. You couldn't talk business. You had to talk Hollywood gossip or other things like that. And because he was so confined in his physical movements, because he was paralyzed, he needed to find other intellectual. That's why he had the stamp collection. It was a way for him to shift his mind from the extraordinary pressures that he was under. A fun thing about FDR being Don Quixote is that in a private letter from Churchill to his wife, Clementine, he says, I had lunch with Don today, meaning Don Quixote, the president of the United States. So he apparently brought his wife into the top secret communications. Anyway, so Roosevelt's journey to Casablanca is pretty incredible. He's traveling on a Boeing 314 flying boat known as the Dixie Clipper. He goes down along the coast of Central South America, flies from Brazil across the Atlantic to Gambia, then up along the west coast of Africa. He's the first sitting president to fly in a plane, the first to visit Africa, the first to leave the country during the war, and the first to visit an active battle zone since Lincoln. So it was a 17,000-mile round-trip journey. And remember, he's paralyzed.
Yeah.
So it's a rather extraordinary. Churchill's adventure down was also pretty dramatic. They almost were shot down. He got quite sick. It was getting to Casablanca was an act of heroism on both their parts. So they meet now, and in this context, meet at the Anfa Hotel, tight security, top secret. Nobody really knows what's going on, and they're coming into this meeting with a lot of resentment on both sides. So the British had won, the battle about going into North Africa. The Americans had gone along. They really didn't have a coherent alternative strategy, but now they did. Now they wanted to make the plan to invade France in 1943, and they were committed to doing this. And they thought they really, had a good case for it. And so, it was a difficult negotiations that were going on. Interestingly, FDR brought two of his sons to Casablanca to help him. One of them, Elliot, was flying reconnaissance missions, and Franklin Jr. was a naval ensign. And so they both get assigned to come to Casablanca, and they show up, and there's their dad. They were shocked as anyone. They didn't know what was going on. Churchill's son, Randolph, was also there. Harry Hopkins' son was also there. So this was one of these opportunities where these leaders would try to use an excuse to get to see their sons, all of whom were serving, in dangerous, combat positions. So the meetings take place over about 10 days. And they all understood what was at stake. And so despite the sort of arguments, and some of it was quite contentious, they had to come up with a plan for how to move forward. And, as everyone knows, For the British, it was we have to drive Rommel out of Africa, invade Sicily, invade Italy, knock Italy out of the war, and get control of the Mediterranean. For their minds, that was what mattered. And for the Americans, to be honest, they were having a hard time. They were being humiliated by Rommel in the desert. Certainly within a few months, it was obvious that the Americans were green. Their equipment was not satisfactory. They didn't have a good logistical operation. They didn't have a coherent command structure. Some of their commanders were clearly unsuited for the role. The soldiers had never faced combat. So it became obvious that Roosevelt had been right. The American army needed to be seasoned. They needed some real combat experience. They needed to see who the leaders were that were going to emerge both from the battlefield and from the headquarters. And so that this idea of continuing to not confront the German Wehrmacht head on is the right solution, despite what was going on. Now, the British had been so resistant about this that at one point, Admiral King and George Marshall had come to Roosevelt and said, look, this is it. We're done. I think we should shift all of our resources to the Pacific. Let's let the British do their own thing. They're a bunch of limey assholes, and we hate them. And Roosevelt basically had to give a direct order to Marshall that torch would be the top priority. And so that's the level of, animosity that had developed. And again, the Americans want to go to France, the British want to go to Sicily and Italy, and Roosevelt backs the British. Only this time, I think there was a little bit less resistance because particularly as, El Alamein and the disasters in the desert, the Americans were realizing that this is harder than we thought it was going to be.
And just to ask you a question, Paul, because there have been a couple of comments in the sidebar about the post-war aspirations as well, and that was the intention of going to Italy from Churchill, all about kind of stopping the Soviets getting west and things like that. But from your understanding, at this moment, FDR and Churchill, are they playing the immediate game of defeating the war, or have either of them or both of them really started considering the map of post-war Europe?
Oh yeah, the map of post-war Europe permeates everything. Right. And yes, in fact, one of the big critiques was that the Americans felt that Sicily and Italy were just a tactic for Churchill to go into the Balkans, which he was continued to push right up until the troops landed on Normandy. Churchill had a good reason. He wanted to protect the Suez Canal. He didn't want the Germans and the Japanese, connecting up and taking over the oil fields in Iraq. There was a lot of reasons. There were strategic reasons for what Churchill wanted, but what he really wanted was to maintain the control of the British Empire after the war. And of course, Roosevelt was having none of it. One of the big issues around the Atlantic Charter was that one of the Atlantic Charter's most important statements was that all people have the right to self-determination. Now, Churchill had to interpret this to mean, well, all countries who are currently under German and Japanese control, when we win the war, they can have self-determination. But India and colonies of the British Empire, they don't get to have control. And Roosevelt really believed that after the war, we're fighting so that people can have the right of self-determination. So that was a constant friction. That was the sand in the gears here for everything.
And these frictions could have been enough to completely break a deal, break a relationship. If Churchill and FDR hadn't at their heart got a good friendship, there's been enough issues at Casablanca and around this time to completely drive a wedge permanently, because we all know in our own lives, if you fall out with someone who's a friend, you make more attempt to rectify the matters than you would if it was someone you don't like. And I think, 80 years on from these events, I think, we shouldn't underestimate how important the fact that they did these humorous messages to each other was to kind of the freedom of the world, because they, as you will explain, that they did persevere despite these huge glaring differences in what the countries envisioned for the future.
Absolutely. And again, that's why I started with, the first letter from Roosevelt to Churchill and the Atlantic Conference and the Christmas in the White House. Those were the foundation on which the friendships were built that allowed it to withstand these conflicts, which were very serious.
Just a quick question. Trevor Sheehan is asking, why is FDR wearing a black armband in that photo?
That's a great question, because he's mourning the death of his mother.
Okay.
But this is him visiting the troops in Morocco. And it went to the U.S. graveyard there. And again, even the troops didn't know that he was there. So he pulls up in a Jeep and everybody's like, who the hell is that? You got to be kidding me. He has lunch with the troops, and again, all four of his sons were serving in uniform, and he felt that he needed to show the troops that he was there with them. He understood the dangers they were under. Churchill, of course, he was going all over the place, constantly going up in the front line and riding in planes, and but this was unusual for Roosevelt because he was so hard for him to travel. So it was a very important emotional moment for him. Now, to go to the geopolitical issue, so this is on January 22nd, the Sultan of Morocco. He's there right next to Roosevelt in the middle, and his 13-year-old crown prince right behind him hosted FDR and Churchill for dinner. And this was an opulent affair, exchange of gifts. They gave Churchill and they gave President Roosevelt a magnificent jewel-encrusted sword and a tiara for Eleanor. Can you imagine Eleanor wearing a jewel-encrusted tiara? But during the evening, Roosevelt has this conversation with the Sultan, basically saying, after the war, we want to work with you. We want to help you develop industries. We want to help, you develop your population and education and all these sorts of things. And Churchill was sort of freaking out. Wait, Africa's our territory. You shouldn't be having these kinds of. And of course, the British had always treated the Sultan, well, the French were in charge, but the European powers had always treated the regional leaders as second-class citizens. And so the Sultan really felt honored that the president of the United States would treat him as an equal and speak to him as an equal about what they could do together after the war. And his son, who became the Sultan afterwards and served for many, many years, always was one of the few Arab countries who continued to support the United States during the whole, 70s and 80s crises in the Middle East, because he remembered this meeting and he remembered the respect that Roosevelt had shown to his father. So the meeting went on for 10 days. Tempers flared, but in the end, they agreed they would go into Sicily, they would go into Italy, they would continue to build up. One of the big issues that had come up and was reinforced in Sicily and Italy is that the key component here are landing craft, and there aren't enough landing craft. It was one thing to build up the soldiers and the tanks and the planes, but the landing crafts, particularly these Higgins landing crafts made out of New Orleans, were the essential element you needed to get these soldiers ashore. And they didn't have enough, and they would fight about that all the way up until literally the soldiers stepped. So they have a press conference in Casablanca, invite 200 correspondents, and the reporters can't believe that Churchill and Roosevelt have been in Casablanca for over a week and they didn't know anything about it. And in this press conference, FDR makes this statement, which was very controversial at the time, where he says, unconditional surrender. We will demand the unconditional surrender of Germany, Japan, and Italy. And Churchill, although they had discussed this, wasn't a total surprise to him. Churchill had not wanted to include Italy in that categorization because he was hoping that they could break Italy off and get Italy to withdraw from the Axis and join the Allies. So it's unconditional surrender. But it really did partly Roosevelt did that to appeal to Stalin, to keep Stalin in the fight. But partly he really believed that the biggest problem at the end of World War I was that you didn't eliminate the militaristic, components of those governments, and that only in an unconditional surrender and a complete rebuilding of these societies could you avoid a third world war. Almost done here. So of course, de Gaulle was had been in London, and General Henri Chiraud was in Gibraltar with Eisenhower, and they hated each other. And de Gaulle refused to come to the conference until the very last moment. And finally, basically, Churchill said, either come or I'm kicking you out of England. And so they came, and FDR, in his devilish ways, insisted that they shake hands in front of the press. So this is actually the photograph before the photograph that you've probably seen of them actually shaking hands, which was on the front page of all the newspapers the next day. But if you can see the expression on their faces, you know exactly how the two of them feel about this. But it was, the politics of the French military was very complicated. So after the conference, Churchill brings Roosevelt to Marrakesh. He says, you have to see sunset over the Atlas Mountains. I've been there. It truly is spectacular. This is the tower at the Consul General's home. Roosevelt had to be carried up in the arms of one of his bodyguards because he couldn't go up the stairs. It was too narrow for his wheelchair. And they sit and they watch this sunset. And the next day, again, this goes to this bonding friendship. As FDR is boarding the plane to fly back to the United States, Churchill tells his aide, quote, "I don't like to see him take off. It makes me far too nervous. If anything happened to that man, I couldn't stand it. He's the truest friend. He has the farthest vision. He's the greatest man I've ever known." Now Churchill didn't talk like that, right? I mean, you know, as far as Churchill concerned, he is the greatest man he had ever known. But it was, and I think this is one of the high moments in their friendship, in their relationship, because they had worked through this animosity between their two teams. They had brought the teams together. They had the hard conversations. They had the fights. They were moving forward. And I think that there was just extraordinary friendship between them. And Churchill then went back to this tower and painted the scene. It was the only painting he did during all of World War II. Painted the scene. It's a beautiful painting, and he gave it to FDR as a gift. And again, I think that sort of sets up what their relationship was. Meanwhile, of course, Stalin, you know, initially was pretty pissed that they weren't going to invade France, but he very quickly came to understand the strategic advantage of going through the soft underbelly. He knew it was still going to pull probably 10 or 15 German divisions out of Russia, and he ended up supporting it, which was a surprise to everybody. And then the French continued to be difficult. You know, de Gaulle insisting that he was the leader of the Free French, even though he had never been elected anything. Roosevelt hated him. Henri Giraud basically was unable to do it. This is Eisenhower approaches Admiral Francois Darlan to take over the French forces. Very controversial. He had been a Vichy sympathizer. He had worked for the Vichy government. He hadn't split off and become part of the Free French. So the patriots hated him. You know, the American press hated him. You know, it was very controversial. And after 2 months, he was assassinated. At which point, you know, de Gaulle essentially becomes the de facto leader of the Free French. And then on to Tunis, but that's not for our conversation today. So this seems like a good spot, and I'll take any questions anybody has.
Well, while the guests are coming up, or the viewers are getting up with some questions, I'll ask one, and it's, you know, Michael Nyberg particularly suggests that the decision to appoint Darlan was possibly one of FDR's worst decisions. Although, you know, when you read the details of the various figures they're trying to do deals, there's no obvious it is a minefield there as they're trying to make contact with these various people within France and outside of France who have been admirals and politicians. They're all it's difficult to pin any of them down as to what their intentions are long term and their motivations. So to try and understand his decision at the time is different to maybe looking at it 80 years on. But what's your feeling about that decision? I mean, it didn't end up affecting things too long because, as you said, he was assassinated. But there was a lot of question marks about that back in the US and around the world. So what's your take? A bad decision by FDR?
Yes, I think it was a bad decision. And most of his, Marshall and Eisenhower, but they were all so frustrated with de Gaulle and with Giraud because they weren't working with him. They weren't, they were acting as though they were equal partners in this endeavor, and they weren't. Now, again, Roosevelt could be petty, and he held a grudge. He never forgot, if he didn't like somebody, it was it. And so I think part of the cause for the bad decision, and it was a bad decision, it might have been their only option, but it was a bad decision, was that his personal animosity towards de Gaulle and de Gaulle's arrogance and dismissiveness towards Roosevelt really was a problem. Again, as I said earlier, could you imagine if Churchill and Roosevelt had the same relations to Gaulle and Roosevelt had? We'd all be speaking German. I mean, they would never have been able to work through the problems and be an effective alliance.
Okay, and So we've had a couple of people talking about the threat of Stalin and whether or not Churchill and Roosevelt should have kind of done some deal about taking on the Soviets at the end of the war. And I know it's a massive, great subject and probably really deserving of its own show or week of discussions. But as I've got you here, and as someone who studied FDR, could they have made that work? Could FDR and Churchill have agreed on something to do with, to change the situation with regards to the Russians and the Soviets?
Again, that's a whole hour-long conversation. But Churchill had a more pragmatic, realistic view of who Stalin was and what was he likely to do and what he actually did do. And Roosevelt had a much more optimistic view. He really sort of believed, first of all, both in the Tehran conference and later at Yalta, that his charming personality would win over this, psychotic sociopath, who starved millions of his own people to death, right? But Roosevelt really believed that he could bring Stalin into the Western alliance, and particularly and join the United Nations and be part of this post-war world. And he believed it so strongly that I think it affected his decision-making. He wanted it to be. And so he looked over those things that indicated that it was unlikely to be. And of course, by the time you get to, in Tehran, Roosevelt basically starts making fun of Churchill during these conferences to try to get on Stalin's good side. And it worked to a certain extent. And by Yalta, Stalin had 1 million soldiers on the ground in Poland. There wasn't much the British and the Americans could do, and they're literally starting World War III. And at that point, there was just no way that was going to happen. So there's a number of bad decisions, quote unquote, bad decisions that are made by Roosevelt during the war. Japanese incarceration is a good example.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
But they're made because he was a pragmatic politician, and it was about, okay, how do I move forward? I have 10 things I want to accomplish. If I have to make one of those things, a bad decision and give in to the worst aspects of human nature, then I will do that if I get these other 9 things to move forward. And he was constantly playing that game. And I think with Stalin, particularly in Yalta, he wanted Stalin to come in the war against Japanese. He wanted Stalin to join the United Nations, and he wanted Stalin to honor his pledge for free and fair elections in Poland. He got 2 out of 3.
No, well, that was a concise answer to what could be a massive, great discussion. So, Trevor Sheehan, who's on next week, an easier question for you: how complete are the FDR archives about this period, and are FDR's views on Darlan in the archive, and are any of them still closed?
Great questions. No, everything that's in the FDR library is open at this point, and I think the most remarkable and unappreciated online asset are the map room papers. Yeah. So after Churchill came to the White House in December 1941, he brought 100 people with him in his whole traveling map room set up, and FDR basically said, "I want one." And so they built this map room in the basement of the White House, which only a few people could actually get in there. Not only did it sort of have the traditional maps on the walls and where are all the units all around the world, but all communication for every military operation, every diplomatic operation that was undergoing went through the map room and was then brought to Roosevelt, so he could have access to the latest information from all people. So those records exist. Every telex between him and Churchill, every telex between him and chief headquarters, every telex between him and, they're all there. It's overwhelming. It's hard to find some things, but all of the communications between him and Churchill are there, easily to find. It says FDR to Churchill, 1941, 1942, Churchill to FDR, etc. And you can scroll through them by date and see exactly what they said. And of course, de Gaulle and Darlan and Giraud play a big part. And again, interesting, the day before the D-Day invasion, the day after D-Day, they spend most of their communications talking about de Gaulle, not about the military operation that's going on. So yes, and there's about 17 million pages of documents. About 1 million of them are online, but they're all available in person if you go there. And the archivists who work there are fantastic. So if you have questions, if you want to see a certain document, they can make copies and distribute them. But the map room papers, I would go in there and spend hours looking through them. It's fascinating.
Who doesn't like maps? Who doesn't like maps?
The sequence around Midway, you can see exactly when the first plane was approached, and they have these amazing maps from D-Day, which were these mimeographed outlines of the shore, and each day they would fill in where each unit was, and these were the maps that FDR actually looked at on June 6th, on June 7th, and June 8th. It's just fascinating.
Brilliant. Well, what a great advert for the library and the archive there. But another question, and we had Kevin Hemel on yesterday talking about Patton and how the fact that the Patton diaries that were released initially were the edited ones by the family, and then only 30 years later the actual, all holds, all gloves off diaries come out later on. Obviously, FDR didn't survive the war, so we only have the correspondence thing from the war. As someone who's obviously studied the man and has an affection for him, faults and all, would he have left us a biography, an autobiography after the war that have benefited our understanding or harmed it? Would you have liked to have seen one, or have we got enough with the material anyway?
Every historian who's ever studied Roosevelt would give their left arm if he had kept a diary or written a damn memoir. The closest we get to that are his letters to Daisy Suckley, his cousin, because he wrote her letters constantly, and she told everyone, "Oh no, I didn't keep a diary, I didn't keep a journal." But after she died, at the age of 90, they pulled the steamer trunk from out from under her bed, and sure enough, there they were.
Wow.
But he didn't, and he would have these little chits. Even he wouldn't allow any of his cabinet members to take notes during cabinet meetings. He was very controlled and contained. The best you get is someone will write him a long memo on some critically important thing, and he'll put a little basically a stick-it note on the front that'll say forward to Daisy, or yes, or sign, or and that's about as close as we get to understanding him. And he had given specific instructions that all of those chits were to be destroyed. But Daisy Suckley and Harry Hopkins, as they were managing the library in the early days and managing his records after FDR died, they said, no, we have to keep them. They're too historically significant.
Brilliant. Well, this is a great question, which I'm going to actually expand on from Rob Crane. And he says, some people have called Eleanor Roosevelt the first female president of the USA, I believe. Did she get on with Churchill too? And I'm going to extend that to referring to Clementine, Churchill's wife, as well, because I'm going to get lots of accusations of being sexist or misogynist now. But in relationships, if two people get on, how their partners get on can also have a huge bearing on how much you see that person. And speaking from kind of personal experience there. So what's the relationship between the wives in this case?
This is actually a great question and a great story, and I wish I had more time to tell it. But Eleanor and Clementine actually became very close friends, despite the radical differences in both their personality and their approaches to their roles. They really, Eleanor did not get along with Winston Churchill at all. She vehemently disagreed with his colonial, imperialistic attitudes. She didn't like the fact he'd get up in the morning and drink and smoke cigars and take a nap in the afternoon and then drink all night, and threw Franklin's schedule off. So she didn't care for Churchill at all. But she formed a very close. In 1943, she went to England and spent several weeks there. And toured the country and would visit the factory where women were working. And of course, Eleanor, at this point had probably given 5,000 public speeches, and had a 6-day-a-week newspaper column and did radio broadcasts. And, she was very outgoing. And of course, Clementine was not. And everything had to be done in a certain way. So I think it may have been when they were in Quebec together, or maybe in London, but they get called to something, and Eleanor says, "Oh yes, we can get up. We can both give some comments." And for Clementine to actually do a public speaking, she would have to have a speechwriter and a coordinator, and then rehearse it and everything. And so that's the difference between their personalities. But they remained close friends after the war, and I think their friendship was very sincere.
Well, thanks for that. And my next question, possibly the final one, is we're going to be talking about the effects of Operation Torch and the Tunisia campaign when we do a panel discussion at the end of the series. And Michael Neuberg, as I said, is going to come on there. Sometimes I make the point on this channel that we're too personality driven, and that we talk about Montgomery, but perhaps we don't talk about Montgomery's staff, or the same with MacArthur. And we focus too much on the people at the top and not enough on the people who are working with them. forgetting that they head up departments with views. But sort of going against that, when we, you made the point earlier about how potentially damaging this situation was with the aspirations, and yet through it, this, the painting and the heartfelt comments they made, is that the Anglophobes in the US, Admiral King hates our guts. De Gaulle doesn't get on with anybody. I suppose for all these lower downs, Marshall and everybody else, if the two big bosses are getting on, it's going to give everybody an incentive to kind of find common ground. So do you think it was important? I know what your answer is going to be, but do you think we're misunderstanding how important that relationship was to the eventual creating of SHAEF and what have you, and the proper second front later on?
Well, this goes to the bane of all historians, which is that you can't tell the whole story.
Yeah.
Yes, in every single story I told today, there are at least 15 other people who played important roles one way or another. And be honest, we always simplify these stories to make them more understandable. As soon as you start trying to layer in all these different people and all the nuances, you lose the narrative arc of what's happening. So we comprise, a staff of 100 people into one person, and he gets credit for everything, and he gets blamed for everything, or she gets blamed for everything. And, it's a simplification which often then denigrates the quality of the people who are working, the staff people who are working around them. There's a couple of books that really are so in depth that you can peel that back. The trilogy, that Rick wrote about, North Africa and Italy and D-Day. You start to get into some of these real. Who was the captain in charge of that unit that did that? They made that decision, that got that tank there. And particularly with someone like Roosevelt, who was in most cases very hands-off with his military leaders. He would say, this is what I want to accomplish. This is what our goal is. I will back you up in however you think you should do it. There's only literally a handful of circumstances where he gave direct orders to the military for specific things. I think Churchill was much more hands-on. And of course, Churchill also had more authority in terms of the way the parliamentary government worked versus the way the American government works, with Congress controlling the purse strings. But I think you're absolutely right. It's imperative to understand how many people were involved in every one of these things, every one of these conferences. We reduced Casablanca to Franklin Roosevelt sitting around looking at the sunset, but it was hundreds of people involved in making that happen.
Brilliant. And the final question, I said that this really is the final one. Andrew Roberts, I think, made the point that there was something like 1,600 biographies of Churchill. There's obviously a lot about FDR, probably not 1,600 though. In terms of the future, FDR will obviously be being talked about in 20, 30, 40 years time. Do you think that he'll be reevaluated in a kind of a negative way? I know people have said he's too left and he makes some mistakes, but from my understanding, he's had a pretty consistent 80-year. He's been well appreciated for most of that time by the great majority of people. Is he ever likely to kind of be toppled off that, or with further study, do you think?
I don't think so, but it's an interesting question because there are examples of that. So he pretty consistently, by all of the sort of historian rankings, he's in the top 3 presidents in American history. You see Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, and they sort of bubble around those 3 top spots. And then it's a pretty big drop to the next one. But if you look at what happened with the American response to the Holocaust, this is a good example of what you're talking about, in that during his administration and immediately after the war, FDR was considered the great savior of the Jews, right? He had Jews in his cabinet. He went out of his way to try to, create opportunities for Jewish refugees. He was seen as a friend of the Jewish community. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, a sort of counter narrative started to emerge as new documents came out and new material came out. And this whole issue, David Wyman wrote the book Abandonment of the Jews. The movie came out, The Voyage of the Damned, about the St. Louis. Yeah. And it shifted public opinion that he was an anti-Semite. He abandoned the Jews. He should have bombed Auschwitz. He should have let the St. Louis land. All these narratives started emerging that weren't based on actual facts. But were based on an emotional response. And so for a good 10 or 15 years, the wave was very much about, why hadn't FDR done more? Why hadn't the U.S. government done more? And I think the academic world has certainly shifted much more back into trying to provide the context for what had happened. No question, the State Department was rife with anti-Semites who deliberately slow-walked the issuance of visas for Jewish refugees. America was a viciously anti-Semitic country. And even in the middle of the war, a majority of Americans felt that Jews were a danger. So, all of those contexts. But I think that pendulum, as it swang into the category of FDR was an anti-Semite and abandoned the Jews, that has now swung back. As you really dig into the stories and look at the evidence and look at the primary source material, it has swung back to a much more reasonable thing. But the moral outrage of what happened, people want to blame somebody. And there's no question that America probably could have done more in the pre-war years. Only 1 year in the lead up to World War II did we actually fill our quota of refugees from Germany. So that gives you some sense. But I do think that what he did, both in the Depression and in World War II, will always be admired as extraordinary leadership under difficult circumstances.
No, definitely. And we could go down the rabbit hole of talking about how Canada turned down boats and other countries turned down boats. It wasn't one country's guilt. That lots of the world was with the benefit of hindsight, naive to the plight, insensitive to the plight. Then it's a massive, great discussion. I said I wasn't going to ask another question. This is actually one from a viewer, so it's not one of mine. So Ian is asking, a fascinating perspective, in particular on FDR. Did he die at a good time for his history? I mean, because the big chapter coming up, of course, is atomic bombs and things in U.S. history. So that's an interesting angle, in terms of, because we have that with Patton. We have, one of the things about Montgomery people criticize is the fact that had Montgomery died, he wouldn't have written his memoirs. He wouldn't have taken credit for everything. And maybe he'd been a little bit less kind of hated by some people. But FDR dying when he did in 45, did that help or hinder his place in history?
Well, obviously it's a question we can't tell, but I believe that FDR's plan, because he was a very sick person, was not to die before the war ended, but that his plan was to, once the war ended, was to turn over the presidency to Harry Truman and to become the head of this new United Nations, to essentially become the president of the world. And that he believed that his personal diplomacy would keep Stalin and the Soviet Union in the alliance. And I think certainly there is a number of things that you can state categorically. One, if FDR had survived, he would never have let the French back into Indochina, and we would not have had the Vietnam War. Ho Chi Minh was an ally. FDR hated imperialism, hated the French. He would never have given Vietnam back to the French. I think you can say that he certainly would have been much more effective in dealing with Stalin than Truman was, partly because of their personal friendship, partly because he had a level of sophistication that Truman didn't have. But I do think that there are some aspects of the post-war world. I mean, there's no question FDR would have dropped the bomb. He would have dropped the bomb the moment he get it. As a matter of fact, he would have dropped the bomb on Germany. People who say it was a racist thing, if the war was still going on with Germany when that bomb was developed, he'd have dropped it on Berlin in a second. Because in their mindset and in post-analysis, you saved lives by bombing Japan. They estimate 1 million American casualties alone, probably multi-million Japanese casualties if America had to invade. So, in their minds, there was no question they were going to use that weapon. I think the great tragedy is that he died. He worked himself to death before he saw the liberation of Europe. And I think, in terms of karma, he deserved to see Hitler body burned in a bunker.
Well, to me, that seems like a perfect way to end the show. So we've had multiple requests to invite you back and continue this discussion, either about just FDR generally or a particular time of his career or as part of a panel. So if you're up for coming back, we can get that arranged. But we will bring things in now. I've really enjoyed this one, Paul. I mean, it's got started at Torch in Tunisia and went in different directions, but that's how the best shows do. So your passion for FDR, the way you told those stories and read the letters has been fantastic. So really enjoyed this. So would you be happy to come back?
Anytime, especially when you want to talk about D-Day.
Well, we can do that. There's that. I don't need much of an excuse to talk about D-Day. So, well, it's been brilliant talking to you, Paul. So, folks, nothing for 2 days. Then Friday, Ian Mitchell has taken us through the Battle of Longstop Hill and the general proceedings of the 78th Division, Tunisia. So back to the battlefield, and then Monday we're finishing off the series with the several shows. So again, please consider becoming a patron or a member of the channel, and subscribe if you're not subscribed, and follow Paul on Twitter, and follow all of my guests on Twitter. So there we are. Thank you everybody for watching. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I will see you again on Friday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.